There are men who arrive quietly, but set everything around them on fire. Connor was that kind of man. When he pushed open that cabin door and his eyes met Pia's, something shifted in the air. Thick, hot, dangerous. He didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to ask. They both knew. That night would be just the beginning of something neither of them would ever forget. He asked a question. She answered with her body. And what happened after? Well, that's what you need to hear. If you feel stories like this deserve to be told, subscribe to the channel now and hit the bell so you don't miss any of our stories. Leave a like. That small gesture tells us you're here, present, feeling every word. And in the comments, tell us, where are you listening to this story from? Your presence makes all the difference. The late afternoon sun transformed the sky over West Hollow into a blanket of oranges and pinks, painting the dry hills with the promise of another day ending. The heat still clung to the skin, thick and heavy, carrying the smell of dry earth and burnt hay. It was the kind of heat that made your body sweat just from breathing, that stuck cotton dresses to skin and made every movement seem slow, deliberate, loaded with intention. Pia stood with her back to the door, stirring a pot of beans on the wood stove. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the woody smell of smoke, creating a homey atmosphere that contrasted with the loneliness she'd carried for so long. Her fingers, calloused from hard work, held the wooden spoon with familiarity. She wasn't expecting anyone. She never expected anyone. The cabin on the outskirts of town was her refuge, her hiding place from the world that had judged her, that had left her behind when her husband left without looking back. That's when the door creaked. It wasn't a loud noise. It was subtle, almost respectful, but enough to make every muscle in Pia's body tense. She didn't turn around immediately. There was something about the presence that entered along with the evening air, something masculine, intense, that changed the atmosphere of the small kitchen. It was as if the air itself had become thicker, hotter, charged with something she couldn't name, but felt coursing through every inch of her skin. Connor West stopped just past the threshold. He was tall, broad shoulders that filled the doorframe, his silhouette cut out against the golden light of the sunset. He wore a cowboy hat worn by time, boots covered in road dust, and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing tanned, strong forearms. He removed his hat slowly, holding it against his chest like a man entering a church, and stood there, still, watching. His eyes were dark amber, the color of whiskey under firelight, and they carried stories he didn't need to tell. Scars from a life lived intensely, marks of someone who had already lost, already loved, already fought and survived. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her, and in that silence there were more words than any conversation could contain. Pia finally turned around. When their eyes met, it was as if the world stopped. There was no sound, just the low crackling of the firewood, the gentle bubbling of the beans, her breathing getting faster, shorter. Pia's heart beat hard, a dull thud against her chest that she was sure he could hear. He didn't look away, and neither did she. It was a gaze that burned, that stripped away layers of defense, that saw beyond the worn dress and the carelessly tied hair. Connor looked at her the way someone recognizes something, not just beauty, but something deeper, more true. Shared pain, recognized loneliness, unspoken desire but screaming. Pia felt her face heat up, not from shame, but from something visceral, primal, something she thought had died in her, along with hope. She swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the wooden spoon until her knuckles turned white. "Are you lost?" Her voice came out rougher than she intended, almost a whisper loaded with something that wasn't just curiosity. Connor took a step inside. Just one. But it was enough to change everything. He didn't invade her space. He filled it like water spreading slowly, inevitable, taking every available corner. No. His voice was deep, rough as sandpaper on raw wood, but there was a softness underneath, a careful gentleness. I knew exactly where I was coming. The air grew thicker. Pia felt her heart race even faster, her skin tingling as if every nerve ending had awakened from a deep sleep. She wanted to ask what he wanted, why he was there, but the words stuck in her throat. Because deep down she knew, or at least she felt it, and that feeling was both terrifying and liberating. Connor placed his hat on the table, slowly, without breaking eye contact. Every movement of his was measured, deliberate, like someone who knows that sudden gestures frighten. He wasn't in a hurry. He had all the patience in the world. And that somehow was even more unsettling, because Pia wasn't sure she could maintain her own defenses for much longer. "Coffee?" she asked, because she needed to do something, say something, break that silence that seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room. "Please." He nodded, his eyes still locked on hers, as if there was something there he needed to memorize, understand, decipher. Pia turned to get a mug, and it was only then that she realized her hands were trembling. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself, but she felt his eyes on her back, hot, attentive, aware of every movement. When she poured the coffee, the mug clinked slightly against the kettle. She placed the mug on the table in front of him, but didn't immediately step away. Connor reached out his hand and his fingers brushed hers when he took the mug. It was a brief touch, accidental, or perhaps not. Pia felt the electricity run through her arm, down her spine, spreading through her entire body like liquid heat. She raised her eyes, and he was watching her with that intensity that made her legs weaken. "Thank you," he said, his voice low, intimate, as if they were sharing a secret. Pia nodded, unable to trust her own voice. She took a step back, creating distance, but the tension didn't diminish. If anything, it only increased. It was like a rope being stretched tighter and tighter, to the point of almost snapping. Connor brought the mug to his lips, and Pia watched, the curve of his mouth, the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes closed briefly as he savored the coffee. When he opened his eyes again and found her watching, a small smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't arrogant. It was knowing, complicit. "Good coffee," he said. "Thank you," she replied, her voice almost failing. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was expectant, charged, like the air before a storm when you know the thunder is coming, but you don't know exactly when. Pia felt every second stretch out, every heartbeat echo in her ears. Connor didn't take his eyes off her, and Pia, for the first time in years, didn't look away. In that moment, neither of them said anything. But the promise was there, suspended between them, silent, powerful, inevitable. And Pia knew with a certainty that both frightened and excited her that nothing would be the same again. The morning light entered through the cracks in the window like golden fingers, drawing stripes on the worn wooden floor. Pia woke to the distant crow of a rooster and the familiar sound of wind beating against the cabin's boards. But there was something different about that morning, an anticipation in the air, an energy that made her heart beat a little faster, even before she fully opened her eyes. Connor had sat at the table until late the night before. They talked little, sparse words about the town, about the approaching winter, about things of no importance that served only to fill the space between glances. When he finally stood to leave, Pia felt a strange pang in her chest, something between relief and disappointment. He just touched the brim of his hat in farewell, and his eyes said everything his mouth didn't. "I'll come back tomorrow, if you'll allow it." She just nodded. She didn't trust her own voice. And now, as she lit the wood stove and put water on to boil, Pia caught herself listening intently to every sound coming from outside. Every bird, every gust of wind, every movement that could be bootsteps approaching. She felt ridiculous, like a teenager waiting for her first love. She was 32 years old, skin marked by the sun, hands rough from hard work. She was no longer that girl who dreamed of romances and happy endings. But then the door opened. Connor entered without knocking, as if he already had the right to be there. But there was no arrogance in his gestures, just a natural familiarity, as if he had always belonged to that place, that moment, that small, hot kitchen. He brought the smell of morning with him, damp earth, leather, something woody and masculine that made Pia close her eyes for a second just to absorb it. "Good morning." His voice was husky, as if he had also just woken up, as if he had thought of her when he opened his eyes. "Good morning," Pia replied, turning to him with the kettle in her hand. Connor took off his hat and placed it in the same spot as yesterday. There was something ritualistic about it, something that created a routine where there shouldn't be one. He approached slowly, and Pia felt each of his steps reverberate on the wooden floor, in the air, in her own body. She poured coffee into an enameled iron mug, the same one from yesterday. Her hands weren't shaking anymore, or she was faking it better. She placed the mug in front of him on the table, and when she leaned forward to push it closer, her thin cotton dress stuck to her sweaty skin. It was a simple dress, washed so many times that the original color no longer mattered, but it molded to every curve of her body, her shoulders, her waist, her hips. Connor followed the movement with his eyes. It wasn't a lustful gaze. It was something deeper, more dangerous. It was admiration mixed with hunger, respect mixed with desire. It was the look of a man who knows exactly what he wants, but who won't take it by force. The look of someone who waits, who courts, who seduces with patience. Pia felt it. She felt the heat of that gaze travel over her body like invisible hands, touching where he didn't touch, lighting fires where there was no flame. She straightened quickly, her heart racing, her face hot. She tried to busy herself with something, grab a cloth, clean the table, do anything to break that charged moment. But Connor spoke before she could step away. "You're beautiful." It wasn't a pickup line. It wasn't an attempt to impress. It was a simple statement, said with the same naturalness with which you say the sky is blue or water is cold. It was a truth he couldn't keep to himself. Pia stopped, looked at him incredulous. "I'm not." "You are," he insisted, leaning slightly forward, his elbows resting on the table, his eyes fixed on her. "And you know it. But it's been so long since anyone reminded you that you started to forget." The words hit Pia like a punch to the stomach, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. She looked away, biting her lip, fighting against something rising in her throat. Not tears, but something worse. Recognition. The pain of being seen after being invisible for so long. "Coffee?" she repeated, her voice hoarse, almost inaudible, desperately trying to return to the safe territory of formalities. Connor smiled slightly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes but carried understanding. "Please." Pia poured another mug for herself and sat on the other side of the table, far enough to breathe, close enough to feel his presence occupying the space. They drank in silence for a moment, steam rising from the mugs in lazy spirals, dancing in the morning light. It was Connor who broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" Pia raised her eyes, cautious. "Depends on the question. Why are you here alone?" The question was direct, but not invasive. There was genuine curiosity there, not judgment. Pia hesitated. She could lie. She could deflect. She could build a wall between them and maintain a safe distance. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw something that completely disarmed her. Vulnerability. As if he also had his own answers to difficult questions. As if he understood. "Because it's easier," she finally answered, her voice low. "Because no one can disappoint you if you don't let anyone in." Connor nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know that feeling." And Pia believed him, because there was something in his eyes that mirrored what she felt. The same loneliness, the same armor, the same exhaustion of carrying everything alone. "And you?" she asked, finding courage she didn't know she had. "Why are you here?" Connor held the mug between his large hands, looking at the dark liquid as if searching for answers there. "Because I got tired of running," he said, his voice so low she almost didn't hear. "Because I saw you yesterday and thought, maybe it's time to stop." Pia's heart skipped a beat. He raised his eyes, and what she saw there made the air leave her lungs. It wasn't just desire. It was hope. It was fear. It was the same thing she felt, the terrifying and wonderful possibility that maybe, just maybe, they didn't need to be alone. Connor stood slowly and walked to her. Pia was paralyzed, her heart beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. He stopped beside her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see every detail of his tanned skin, every strand of stubble, every small scar that told untold stories. He extended his hand. Pia looked at the hand, large, calloused, strong. A hand that knew hard work, that knew struggle, but that in that moment was open, offered, vulnerable. She should pull back. She should put distance between them. She should protect her already too broken heart. But instead, Pia placed her hand in his. The touch was electric. His fingers closed around hers, firm but not oppressive, gentle but not weak. It was a touch that said, "I see you," and "I'm here," and "you're not alone," all at once. Connor pulled her gently to her feet. They stood there face to face, hands joined, breaths mingling, the entire world reduced to that small space between their bodies. He raised his other hand, slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and touched her face. His fingers traced the line of her jaw with a delicacy that made her close her eyes. It was a touch of reverence, of discovery, of promise. "Pia," he whispered her name like a prayer. She opened her eyes, and what she saw in his face melted her. Desire, yes, but also tenderness, patience, respect. Connor leaned forward, slowly, so slowly that Pia had all the time in the world to pull away. But she didn't pull away. His lips were inches from hers when the sound of a wagon passing on the road echoed loudly, breaking the spell. Pia stepped back instinctively, her heart racing, her cheeks burning. Connor let his hands fall, but there was no frustration on his face, just that small smile. Patient, knowing. "I should go," he said softly. "Yes," Pia agreed, her voice failing. He picked up his hat, put it on slowly, and walked to the door. He stopped at the threshold, looking back. "Tomorrow?" he asked. And Pia, unable to fight what she felt, nodded. Tomorrow. When the door closed behind him, Pia leaned against the table, her legs weak, her heart still racing. That touch never happened, but somehow it was the most intense touch she'd ever felt. The days began to blend into each other, creating a new rhythm, a silent dance that neither of them had planned, but both accepted with a disturbing naturalness. Connor returned every morning, always with the sunrise, as if the golden light painting the dry hills was his personal invitation. And Pia, who before woke only out of necessity, began to open her eyes earlier, her heart already racing even before hearing his footsteps approaching. He never asked permission. He simply arrived, took off his hat and began to work. On the third day, Pia woke to the sound of an axe cutting wood. She ran to the window and saw Connor in the yard, shirtless under the still weak morning sun, the muscles in his back contracting and relaxing with each precise strike. Sweat was already beginning to glisten on his tanned skin, drawing lines that ran down his spine, disappearing at the waist of his worn pants. Each movement was controlled, powerful, hypnotizing. Pia stood there, hidden behind the thin curtain, watching. She felt her face heat up, her heart beat faster, something tightened deep in her belly. It wasn't just physical desire, though that was present, intense, impossible to ignore. It was something deeper. It was the feeling of being cared for, of not being alone, that someone finally had chosen to stay. When Connor finished cutting enough firewood for 2 weeks, he stacked the pieces with military precision beside the house, wiped the sweat from his forehead with his forearm, and put his shirt back on. Only then did he knock on the door. Pia opened it, pretending she hadn't been watching him for the last 40 minutes. "Good morning," he said, that small, knowing smile at the corner of his mouth, as if he knew exactly what she had done. "You don't need to," she began, but he interrupted her with a gentle wave of his hand. "I know I don't need to," Connor said, his eyes fixed on her with that intensity that made her legs weaken. "I want to." And that simple statement disarmed all the defenses Pia had built. Because he wasn't doing this out of pity or obligation, or because he expected something in return. He wanted to. He simply wanted to be there, do this, take care of her. And that raw, honest truth was more seductive than any pretty words could be. She let him in, served coffee, and they drank together in comfortable silence. Afterward, Connor inspected the roof. "There are some loose tiles," he said, looking up, his hands on his hips. "When it rains, water's going to get in." "I know," Pia admitted, embarrassed, "but I can't get up there by myself." Connor just nodded, and without saying anything more, went to get an old ladder from the barn. Pia watched as he climbed with the agility of someone who had done this 1,000 times, his body balanced, his movements sure. She stood below, holding the ladder, not because he needed it, but because she wanted a reason to be close, to look up and see him against the blue sky, working, caring, staying. "Can you pass that hammer?" Connor asked from above. Pia grabbed the tool and climbed the first few rungs to hand it to him. When their hands touched in the exchange, his fingers lingered a second longer than necessary, his eyes finding hers even from up on the ladder. Neither of them said anything, but that brief touch spoke volumes. The ritual established itself over the following days. Connor arrived early, worked in silence, fixing fences, cleaning the well, adjusting the creaking door, replacing rotten boards on the porch. And Pia cooked, washed clothes, tended the small garden, always aware of where he was, what he was doing, how he moved. There was a strange sensuality in that routine. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't aggressive. It was subtle, built in layers. A lingering look when he came in covered with dust. The way she wet her lips when he drank water straight from the mug. The way his fingers brushed hers every time she passed him something. The way his voice grew huskier when he spoke to her at the end of the day. One afternoon, while Pia was in the yard hanging clothes on the line, Connor appeared behind her. She didn't hear him approach. He moved with surprising softness for a man of his size. But she felt it. She felt his presence, the heat, the masculine energy that changed the air around them. Pia continued pinning a sheet to the line, pretending not to have noticed. But her hands trembled slightly, and she knew he noticed. Connor said nothing. He just stood there a few steps behind her, breathing slowly, watching. The silence stretched out, thick, charged, full of unspoken things. Pia could feel his eyes tracing the line of her back, the curve of her exposed neck where her hair was pinned up, the way her dress moved with the breeze. She finished pinning the sheet and turned slowly. They stood face to face, so close that Pia could see the small lines around his eyes, marks of years lived under the sun. She could see the stubble, the full lips, the strong curve of his jaw. She could smell him. Earth, sweat, something woody and masculine that made her want to move closer, bury her face in his chest and simply breathe. "Pia," Connor began, his voice hoarse, low, loaded with something that made her heart race. "Yes?" she whispered, barely able to breathe. He raised his hand slowly, giving her time to pull away. But she didn't pull away. She never pulled away anymore. His fingers touched a strand of hair that had escaped from her bun and tucked it behind her ear with a delicacy that contrasted with the strength of his calloused hands. "You have a leaf in your hair," he said softly, removing something she hadn't even noticed. It was an excuse, they both knew it. But it was an excuse that allowed the touch, that created closeness, that kept the dance between them alive and pulsing. Pia smiled slightly, and it was the first time Connor had seen her truly smile. The effect was devastating. His eyes lit up, his lips parted slightly, and for a moment he looked like a man who had found something he thought was lost forever. "Thank you," she said, her voice coming out softer, more intimate than she intended. Connor didn't step away immediately. He stayed there, his hand still near her face, his eyes wandering over every detail, and her lips, the freckles on her nose, the way the afternoon light made her brown eyes shine like honey. "Do you know what you're doing to me?" he suddenly asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Pia felt the air leave her lungs. "What do you mean?" Connor took another step closer, eliminating whatever distance still existed. Now she could feel the heat of his body, could see the rapid pulse at the base of his neck, could feel her own breathing becoming short and irregular. "I think about you," he confessed, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her dizzy. "All the time. When I'm working, when I'm trying to sleep, when I wake up in the morning. You're the first thing in my head and the last thing before I close my eyes." The words fell on Pia like rain on dry land. She didn't know what to say, how to respond to something so honest, so vulnerable. So she said nothing. She just raised her hand and placed it on his chest, feeling his heart beating strong and fast under her palm. Connor covered her hand with his, pressing it against his heart. "Do you feel it?" he asked. "Yes," she whispered. "That's what you do to me." They stayed like that for a moment that seemed eternal, hands intertwined over his heart, eyes locked, breaths synchronized. The world around them disappeared. There was no more West Hollow, no more past, no more fear. There were just the two of them, suspended in that moment, charged with promise. It was Pia who pulled away first, not because she wanted to, but because she needed to. Because if she stayed like that for one more second, she would surrender completely, and some part of her was still afraid of what that meant. Connor let her go, but not without holding her hand for one more second, squeezing gently before releasing. "Tomorrow," he said, not as a question, but as a certainty. "Tomorrow." Pia agreed. And when he turned to leave, Pia stood there, her hand still warm where he had touched it, her heart still racing, her body still vibrating with his closeness. The ritual had begun, and they both knew it was only warming up. The afternoon heat was oppressive, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer over the dry earth, that stuck clothes to bodies and made every breath a conscious effort. Pia had been in the kitchen for hours, trying to make bread, a simple task that suddenly seemed impossible. The dough wasn't rising right, the oven was too hot, and her patience had run out 3 attempts ago. When the smell of burning filled the kitchen, Pia let out a low curse, something she rarely did, and pulled the pan from the oven with trembling hands full of frustration. The bread was black around the edges, hard as stone in the middle. It was the last straw of a difficult week, of poorly slept nights thinking about Connor, of entire days aware of his every movement, every look, every almost touch that left her restless and confused. "Damn it!" she cursed louder this time, throwing the pan on the table forcefully. The metallic sound echoed through the small kitchen. That's when she heard footsteps. Connor entered without knocking. He never knocked anymore. The door simply opened, and he was there, filling the space with his presence, bringing the smell of earth and work and something indefinable that was only his. But this time, when he came in and saw Pia standing in the middle of the kitchen, her shoulders tense, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, he didn't say anything immediately. He just watched. Pia's face was flushed, not just from the heat, but from frustration, from anger at herself, from everything she was feeling and couldn't name. Her hair had escaped from the bun and fell in damp strands across her face and neck. The dress stuck to her sweaty body, revealing every curve, every line. She looked fragile and strong at the same time, a woman on the edge, fighting to maintain control over things slipping through her fingers. Connor closed the door behind him and approached slowly, not like a predator, but like someone approaching a frightened animal, careful, respectful, attentive. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low, soft, without judgment. "I burned the bread," Pia replied, and she hated how her voice came out trembling, vulnerable. "I burned the damn bread and I can't do anything right and I—" Her voice failed. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, trying to compose herself. But she was so tired of pretending she was okay, of pretending she felt nothing, of pretending his presence didn't affect her in every possible way. Connor stopped behind her. He didn't touch her, but he was close enough for her to feel his heat, his solidity, the masculine presence that somehow calmed and agitated her at the same time. "Let it cool," he said softly, his voice like dark honey. "Then you cut off the burnt parts. The rest is still good." It was something simple, practical, but the way he said it, unhurried, without judgment, as if burning bread was the most normal thing in the world, made something inside Pia break. Not in a bad way, but like when you've been holding something too tight for too long and finally let go. She turned slowly, and when her eyes met his, she saw something that completely disarmed her. It wasn't pity, it was understanding, it was empathy. It was the look of someone who knew frustration, who knew failure, who knew the weight of trying to hold everything together when inside you're falling apart. "It's not about the bread," Pia whispered, her voice choked. "I know," Connor replied, his eyes never leaving hers. And he knew, somehow he always knew. A single tear rolled down Pia's face. She wasn't crying, not really. It was just that rebellious tear, the result of holding so much in, repressing so much. She raised her hand to quickly wipe it away, embarrassed, but Connor was faster. His finger touched her cheek first, soft, almost reverent, tracing the path of the tear until he captured it. Then he placed his entire hand on the side of her face, the calloused palm contrasting with the soft skin, his fingers burying themselves slightly in her loose hair. "Pia." He said her name like a prayer, like a sigh, like a promise. She closed her eyes, leaning instinctively against his hand. The touch was firm but gentle, protective but not possessive. It was the kind of touch that said, "I'm here, and you're not alone, and I won't hurt you," all at once. When Pia opened her eyes again, Connor was closer. She hadn't noticed him move, but now there was almost no space between them. She could see every detail of his face, the jawline covered with stubble, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the full, slightly parted lips, the dark amber eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart want to leap out of her chest. "You don't have to be strong all the time." Connor said softly, his thumb caressing her cheekbone in slow, hypnotic movements. "Not with me." The words hit her in the chest, in the stomach, in places she didn't know could still be hit, because that was exactly what she had done for so long. Be strong, keep the walls up, not let anyone see the cracks. But there, with Connor looking at her as if she were the most precious thing he'd ever seen, Pia felt all those walls begin to crumble. His other hand came up, now holding her face between both palms, and Pia placed her own hands over his wrists, not to push away, but to anchor, to hold, to make sure this was real. "I'm afraid," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of what?" Connor asked, leaning his forehead against hers, so close now that their breaths mingled. "Of you," Pia admitted, trembling. "Of what I feel when you're near. Of what will happen when you leave." Connor held her face more firmly, forcing her to look at him. "I'm not leaving," he said, his voice hoarse but firm, each word loaded with certainty. "You understand? I'm not going anywhere." "How can you be sure?" "Because I never wanted to stay before," Connor replied, and the raw honesty in those words left her breathless. "I always ran. From everything, from everyone. But you make me want to plant my feet on the ground." Pia felt more tears threatening to fall, but this time they weren't from frustration or fear. They were from something different. Relief, hope, that dangerous and wonderful feeling that maybe, just maybe, she could have this, could have him, could have something good. His hand slid from her face to her neck, his fingers tracing the line of her throat until they rested at the base, where her pulse beat strong and fast. He could feel the effect he had on her, every acceleration of her heart, every irregular breath, every subtle tremor. "Do you feel it?" he asked, his voice low, intimate. "Yes," Pia whispered. "That's what you do to me too," Connor said, taking her hand and placing it over his own chest right above his heart. Every single day, every single night, Pia felt his heart beating strong and fast under her palm, wild, alive, intense. It was confirmation that she wasn't alone in this, that what she felt was reciprocated, that this connection between them was real and powerful and impossible to ignore. Connor tilted his head, his nose brushing hers, his lips inches away. Pia could feel his hot breath mingling with hers, could see the desire burning in his eyes, but also the restraint. He wasn't going to take, he was going to wait. He was going to give her the power to decide. "Tell me to stop," he whispered against her lips. "If you don't want this, tell me now and I'll stop." But Pia said nothing, because stopping was the last thing she wanted. Instead, she closed the small distance between them and pressed her lips against his. The kiss started soft, a careful exploration, a question being asked and answered, but it quickly deepened, intensified, transformed into something more urgent, more desperate. Connor's arms wrapped around her, pulling her against him, and Pia melted into that embrace, her hands moving up his broad shoulders until they intertwined behind his neck. Connor kissed like a starving man, finally allowing himself to eat. There was hunger there, yes, but also reverence. Every movement of his mouth was purposeful. Every touch of his tongue was a mapping, a memorization. He kissed her as if he wanted to know every corner, every taste, every sigh. Pia arched against him, feeling every hard line of his masculine body pressed against hers, and a low moan escaped her throat. Connor responded with a guttural sound, his hands sliding down her back, pressing her closer, eliminating whatever space still existed. When they finally separated, both were breathless, foreheads touching, eyes closed, trying to recover their breath and control. "Pia," Connor whispered, his voice hoarse and trembling. "I know," she replied, opening her eyes to find his fixed on her. And they knew. They knew they had crossed a line, that there was no going back, that everything had changed in that moment. But neither of them regretted it. Connor held her face once more, kissed her forehead softly, then the tip of her nose, then her cheek. "I'm not leaving," he repeated, a promise sealed with kisses. And Pia, for the first time in years, believed him. Night fell over West Hollow like a black velvet blanket, bringing with it a thick silence loaded with anticipation. The stars shone brightly in the clear sky, dotting the darkness with thousands of points of light that seemed like silent witnesses to what was to come. The air had cooled a bit, but still carried the residual heat of the day, creating that perfect temperature that made the skin tingle. Pia was on the porch, sitting in the old rocking chair that creaked with every movement. She had made coffee. Not because she needed the caffeine, but because she needed to do something with her restless hands. The rich, strong aroma mixed with the smell of damp earth and night vegetation, creating an atmosphere that was both familiar and charged with something new, something different. Connor hadn't left that afternoon. After the kiss in the kitchen, after that moment that changed everything, he stayed. He fixed the bedroom window that was stuck, replaced a loose board on the porch, adjusted the well pump. He worked in silence while Pia watched from a distance, her heart still racing, her lips still tingling with the memory of his touch. Now, as night enveloped everything, Connor climbed the porch steps with that confident, measured walk that made something tighten deep in Pia's belly. He carried 2 empty mugs in his hand, the same ones she had served coffee in earlier. There was something symbolic about that, something about empty vessels waiting to be filled again. "May I?" he asked, indicating the chair beside hers. Pia nodded, unable to trust her own voice. She watched as he sat down, his large, solid body making the wooden chair groan under the weight. He stretched out his long legs, crossed his ankles, and leaned back with a sigh of contentment, like a man who had finally found his place in the world. Pia poured coffee for both of them, and when she handed him the mug, their fingers touched. It wasn't accidental this time. It was intentional. Connor held the mug but didn't pull it away immediately. Instead, he let his fingers rest on hers for a long, charged moment, his eyes fixed on her even in the dim light. The yellowish light from the lantern Pia had placed on the windowsill cast dancing shadows over his face, accentuating the strong line of his jaw, the curve of his lips, the intensity of eyes that seemed to see through all her defenses. "Beautiful night," Connor finally said, his voice husky and low, breaking the silence, but not the tension. "Yes," Pia agreed, looking at the starry sky. "It's always been my favorite time of day." "Why?" Pia thought for a moment, the words forming slowly in her mind before leaving her mouth. "Because at night you can be honest," she said softly. "The darkness hides enough that you can reveal what you need to. Does that make sense?" Connor turned completely toward her, his whole body facing her direction, attentive. "It makes perfect sense," he replied, and there was something in his voice that made Pia look back at him. "So tell me a truth, something you wouldn't say during the day." Pia's heart raced. It was a dangerous invitation, a door being opened to something she wasn't sure she was ready to walk through. But there was safety in darkness, as she herself had said, and there was something in his look that made her want to be brave. "I think about you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "All the time, when you're here and when you're not. I wake up thinking about you, fall asleep thinking about you. And it scares me because I swore I'd never let anyone have that power over me again." Connor was silent for a moment, processing the words. Then, slowly, he reached out and intertwined his fingers with hers. It wasn't a sexual gesture. It was something deeper. Connection, understanding, acceptance. "Your turn," Pia said, finding the courage to turn the tables. "Tell me a truth." Connor looked at their intertwined hands, his thumb tracing slow circles on the back of her hand. When he spoke, his voice was loaded with a vulnerability she had never heard before. "I spent the last 10 years running," he began. "From town to town, from job to job, never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots, to really know anyone. I thought it was freedom, but it was just fear in disguise." He paused, breathing deeply before continuing. "Then I got here. I saw you in that kitchen with your back turned, stirring that pot, and something in me just stopped. For the first time in a decade, I didn't want to be anywhere else. I wanted to stay, and that terrifies and frees me at the same time. Pia felt tears burn behind her eyes, not from sadness, but from recognition, because she understood exactly what he was saying, that paralyzing fear of wanting something, of needing someone, of risking your heart again. "Connor," she began, but he squeezed her hand gently, silently asking her to let him continue. "Let me finish," he said, "because I need to say this. I need you to know." Pia nodded, her heart beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. Connor leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, but never letting go of her hand. His eyes gleamed in the faint lamplight, intense and honest. "I'm not an easy man, Pia," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "I have a past. I have scars. I have demons that still wake me up in the middle of the night. I don't have much to offer beyond hands that know hard work and a heart that finally decided to stop running." He paused, his gaze piercing hers. "But what I have, I give completely. Not halfway. Not with one foot out the door. If you let me stay, if you let me in, I'm yours. Completely." The intensity of those words, of the raw and honest promise they carried, took Pia's breath away. She wanted to respond, wanted to say yes, that she wanted this, wanted him, but the words stuck in her throat. Connor stood slowly, pulling Pia up with him. They stood face to face on the porch, hands still intertwined, bodies close but not touching. The lamplight danced between them, creating an intimate space in the middle of the vast night. "I need to know something," Connor said, his voice low and husky, loaded with something that ignited every nerve in Pia's body. "Before we go any further, before I can't turn back anymore." "What?" Pia whispered. Connor took another step closer, eliminating almost all the distance. His other hand came up, fingers tracing the line of her arm in a touch so light it almost seemed imaginary, but it wasn't. It was real. It was him touching her, marking a path, making promises with his fingers that his mouth hadn't yet made. "Can you handle a man like me?" he began, his voice dropping an octave, becoming even huskier, more intimate. All night long, the question hung in the air between them, loaded with layered meanings. It wasn't just about physical desire, though that was there, pulsing and impossible to ignore. It was about everything, about handling his intensity, his presence, the totality of what he was offering. It was about being ready to take the leap, to trust, to surrender completely. Pia didn't answer immediately. Her eyes traveled over his face, the strength there, but also the vulnerability, the confidence, but also the fear. He was offering himself completely, putting everything on the table, waiting to see if she would take it or refuse it. Instead of answering with words, Pia released one hand and brought it to his face. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw, rough with stubble, then descended down his neck until they rested over his heart. She could feel the strong, fast beat, wild and vulnerable at the same time. Then, keeping her eyes fixed on his, she took half a step forward, eliminating any and all distance that still existed. Her body pressed against his, chest against chest, breath against breath. She could feel the heat radiating from him, could feel every tense muscle, every hard line pressed against her softer curves. "Yes," she finally said, her voice firm despite her racing heart. "I can handle it." Connor's eyes closed for a second, as if absorbing that answer, letting it sink deep. When he opened them again, there was something different there. Not just desire, but also relief, gratitude, promise. His hands found her waist, large and warm through the thin fabric of her dress. He pulled her even closer, if that was possible, and tilted his head until his forehead rested against hers. "Are you sure?" he whispered, giving her one last chance to pull back. Pia responded by pressing her lips against his, firm, decided, without hesitation. It was a different kiss from what they had shared before. It wasn't exploration or discovery. It was claiming. It was her saying yes with her whole body, with every fiber of her being. Connor moaned low against her mouth, his hands gripping her waist, then moving up her back, burying themselves in her hair. The kiss deepened, intensified, transformed into something wild and necessary, and completely inevitable. When they finally separated, Both were breathing hard, their bodies trembling with contained need. Connor held her face between his hands, his eyes traveling over every detail as if memorizing, engraving that moment forever. "So this is it," he said, his voice hoarse. "There's no going back." "No going back," Pia agreed, and there was absolute certainty in her voice. Connor kissed her again, once, twice, 3 times, short, intense kisses that were promises, oaths, silent vows. Then he took her by the hand and guided her inside the house, the door closing softly behind them. The night had only just begun, and they both knew that when the sun rose, nothing would be the same again. The sun hadn't yet reached its highest point when Connor decided to clean the well. It was a job he'd been putting off for days, but one that needed to be done before the autumn rains came and turned the water into unusable mud. Pia had woken up different that morning, lighter, softer, as if something inside her had finally allowed itself to relax, allowed itself to trust. She watched him from the kitchen window as he prepared, taking off his shirt under the already hot sun and tossing it over the nearby fence. His body was a work of art sculpted by hard work, broad shoulders that narrowed to a firm waist, defined muscles that moved under tanned skin, some scattered scars that told stories of a life lived without protection. Pia bit her lip, feeling something warm spread through her lower belly. After the night before, that promise made on the porch, those kisses that left her dizzy and wanting more, she felt exposed and powerful at the same time, as if she had crossed a bridge and was now in new territory, scary but exciting. Connor descended into the well, using the thick rope tied to the wooden structure. Pia saw when he disappeared into the damp darkness below, and something in her chest tightened, an irrational, visceral worry that something could happen to him now that she had finally allowed him to matter. She finished washing the breakfast dishes, but her eyes kept returning to the window, to the well, waiting to see him emerge. The minutes dragged like hours. She dried her hands on her apron, took it off and went out into the yard. The midday heat hit her like a physical wave. The dirt ground was dry and cracked under her bare feet. The air vibrated with the shrill song of cicadas, and the smell of dry grass mixed with hot earth filled her lungs with each breath. Pia walked to the well and leaned over the stone edge, looking down. "Connor?" she called, her voice echoing off the damp walls. "I'm here." The answer came from below, hoarse and distant. "Almost done." Pia waited, her fingers drumming nervously on the rough stone. She could hear the sounds of him working down there, the banging of something metallic against stone, the splash of water, the heavy breathing of physical effort. After a few more minutes that seemed eternal, she saw the rope tense and Connor begin to climb. He emerged slowly, muscle by muscle being revealed by the sunlight. He was covered in mud, on his arms, chest, face, ornal, and dripping dirty water. But even so, or perhaps because of it, there was something primitively attractive about him. It was the image of a man unafraid of dirty work, who used his hands to build and fix, who sweated and exerted himself without complaint. Connor grabbed the edge of the well and pulled himself out with the strength of his arms. When he stood on the edge, a little unsteady from the effort, Pia instinctively reached out her hand to help him down. He took her hand, his muddy fingers closing around hers. And that's when it happened. The stone under Connor's feet was wet, slippery. When he transferred his weight, his foot slid. Pia tried to hold him, but instead was pulled forward. She let out a short scream, her hands searching for something to grab onto, and found his bare chest. Connor caught her midair, his strong arms wrapping around her as he staggered backward, trying to maintain his balance. They spun once, twice, before finally stopping. Connor with his back against the wooden structure of the well, Pia pressed against his front. For a moment, neither of them moved. Pia had her hands flat on his chest, feeling his heart beating strong and fast under her palms. The cold mud stuck between them, but underneath it there was only heat, the heat of his body, his skin, blood pulsing through his veins. She could feel every deep breath he took, his chest rising and falling against hers, air entering and leaving his lungs. Connor had his hands on her waist, large, firm, holding her against him as if afraid she would fall if he let go. His fingers left mud marks on her dress, but neither of them cared. Slowly, very slowly, Pia raised her eyes. His eyes were already on her, intense, dark, full of something that made the air catch in her lungs. It wasn't just desire, though that was there, evident and impossible to ignore. It was need. It was recognition. It was that visceral connection that had existed between them since the first glance, but which now, with their bodies pressed together and their defenses destroyed, was exposed and raw. "Are you okay?" Connor asked, his voice hoarse, the words vibrating in his chest in a way Pia felt in her entire body. "I am," she whispered, unable to look away. But neither of them moved away. Connor's fingers closed slightly on her waist, not hurting, but firmly enough to make Pia intensely aware of every point of contact between them. His thumb traced a small circle on the side of her ribs, an almost unconscious movement that sent waves of heat through her spine. "Pia," he began but didn't finish, as if there were no words for what he was feeling. She understood because she was feeling the same thing. One of Pia's hands moved up from his chest to his neck, her fingers tracing the line of his throat, feeling the rapid pulse there. Connor briefly closed his eyes, his jaw tensing, as if that simple touch was a torture too sweet to bear. When he opened his eyes again, there was a question there, permission being asked. He wasn't going to take, he never would. But he was making clear what he wanted, what he needed. Pia responded by rising on her toes and pressing her lips against his. The kiss exploded between them, not soft or gentle like the previous ones, but hungry, urgent, desperate. Connor's hands moved down from her waist to her hips, pulling her even closer, eliminating any millimeter of space that still existed. Pia wrapped her arms around his neck, her fingers burying themselves in his wet, muddy hair. Not caring about the dirt, just wanting to be closer, always closer. His tongue invaded her mouth, exploring, claiming, savoring. Pia moaned low, the sound being swallowed by the kiss, and felt Connor tremble against her. His hands moved up her back, large and warm, even through the damp fabric, mapping every curve, every line, as if trying to memorize her shape. When they finally separated to breathe, both were gasping. Connor rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed, heavy breathing mixing with hers. "This is crazy," he murmured, but there was a small smile at the corner of his mouth. "It is," Pia agreed, laughing low, a laugh that came from deep in her chest, liberating and light. Connor opened his eyes and looked at her with that intensity that always disarms her. "You're covered in mud," he pointed out, his voice loaded with amusement. Pia looked down and saw he was right. Her white dress was stained brown where their bodies had pressed together. There was mud on her arms, probably on her face too. She must look like a disaster. "Your fault," she replied, unable to contain her smile. "My fault?" Connor raised an eyebrow, feigning indignation. "You're the one who pulled me. I was trying to help you. And look how that turned out," he said, but his eyes shone with something warm and playful. Pia laughed again, and Connor watched fascinated, as if the sound of her laughter was the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard. Then, impulsively, he dipped his hand in the water from the nearby bucket and sprinkled a few drops on her face. Pia threw her head back, yelping in surprise, and then looked at him with wide eyes. "You did not just do that. I did," Connor said, the smile now complete, transforming his entire face, taking years of worry off it and making him almost boyish. Pia wet her hand in the water too and splashed him back in retaliation. Connor laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that echoed through the yard. They stood there, playing like children, splashing water on each other, laughing until their ribs hurt, forgetting for a moment all their fears and worries. When they finally stopped, soaked and breathless, Connor pulled Pia back against him, more gently this time. He tucked a strand of wet hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on the side of her face. "I like seeing you happy," he said softly. "I had forgotten what it was like." Pia admitted, vulnerability returning to her voice. "To be happy. Then, let's do this more often," Connor promised, sealing the words with a soft kiss on her forehead. They stayed like that for another moment, wet, dirty, embraced under the midday sun. And Pia thought that maybe, just maybe, she could get used to this, to being touched, to being seen, to being happy. with him. Night had fallen softly over West Hollow, bringing with it a cool breeze that relieved the persistent heat of the day. Stars began to dot the darkened sky, and from a distance came the low sound of crickets singing their nightly song. Inside the small cabin, the golden light from the lantern cast dancing shadows on the wooden walls, creating an intimate and welcoming atmosphere. Pia was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of stew that simmered slowly on the wood stove. The aroma of cooked meat, onion and herbs spread through the air, mixing with the familiar smell of wood smoke and coffee. She had spent the entire afternoon preparing that meal, not just because they needed to eat, but because she wanted to. She wanted to do something special for Connor, wanted to show with actions what she still didn't have the courage to say with words. Connor was outside, washing at the water pump. She could hear him through the open window, the metallic creak of the pump, the splash of cold water, a low sigh of relief. Pia smiled to herself, imagining the scene. Him bent over the stream of water, washing away the day's dirt, muscles contracting, water running down tanned skin. She shook her head, trying to focus on the food and not on the images her mind insisted on creating. But it was hard. Everything became hard since he arrived. Hard to think about anything but him. Hard to keep her hands busy when all she wanted was to touch him. Hard to breathe normally when he was near. The door opened and Connor came in, bringing the smell of clean water and soap. He had put on a clean shirt, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, the first buttons open, revealing a triangle of still damp skin. His dark hair was wet and combed back with his fingers, drops of water still glistening at the ends. Pia turned and their eyes met across the small kitchen. Something passed between them. That constant electricity, that delicious tension that never really disappeared, just varied in intensity. "Hungry?" she asked, her voice coming out huskier than intended. "Always," Connor replied, but the way he looked at her made it clear he wasn't just talking about food. Pia felt heat rise from her neck to her cheeks. She turned quickly back to the stove, stirring the stew with more attention than necessary, trying to calm her racing heart. Connor approached from behind, silent as always, moving with that natural grace that seemed impossible for a man his size. Pia felt him before seeing him, before hearing him. She felt his presence changing the air around them, warming the space between them. He stopped right behind her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could hear his breathing becoming deeper, could feel his eyes tracing the line of her back. "Smells good," he said, his voice low and intimate. "Thank you," Pia replied without turning, her fingers gripping the wooden spoon. "I wasn't talking about the food." The words fell over her like warm honey, spreading through every nerve ending. Pia closed her eyes for a second, trying to compose herself, trying to remember how to breathe. Then she felt it. His fingers, light as feathers, tracing a slow line from her shoulder to her elbow. It wasn't an accidental touch. It was intentional, deliberate, reverent. It was Connor exploring, asking without words if he could, if she wanted it, if he was welcome. Pia stopped stirring the stew. She simply stopped, the spoon suspended in the air, her entire body focused on that single touch that seemed to ignite every cell. His fingers continued the journey, from elbow to wrist, then around the hand holding the spoon, lightly intertwining with hers. Connor took another step, eliminating the last space between them. Now his chest was pressed lightly against her back, and Pia could feel every breath he took, every beat of his heart echoing against her spine. "Pia," then he whispered near her ear, his hot breath making the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "Look at me." Slowly, as if moving through thick honey, Pia set the spoon aside and turned. The movement brought her even closer to him. Now they were face to face, chest to chest, with no space between their bodies. Connor's hands naturally found her waist, resting there with a familiarity that shouldn't exist yet, but somehow felt completely right. Her eyes moved up, over his broad chest, over his throat where his pulse beat visibly, over his strong jaw covered with stubble, until finally meeting his eyes. Dark amber glowing in the golden lamplight, fixed on her with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. "I think about you all day," Connor said, repeating words he'd said before, but now carrying a different weight, a new urgency. "When I'm working, when I'm trying to sleep, when I wake up, You're always here. He touched his own forehead with a finger. And here. His hand descended to his chest over his heart. Pia placed her hand over his, pressing it against the heart that beat strong and fast. I know, she whispered, because I feel the same way. Something changed in Connor's face, as if those simple words had knocked down the last wall, removed the last doubt. His hands moved up from her waist to her face, holding it between his large, calloused palms, with a gentleness that contrasted with the strength she knew he possessed. I need to kiss you, he said, not as a request, but as a confession. I need to kiss you now or I'll go crazy. Then kiss me, Pia replied, her voice barely above a whisper, but firm, decided. Connor pulled her to him and kissed her. But this kiss was different from all the others. It wasn't the careful exploration of the first time, nor the desperate urgency of the second. This was slow, deep, devastating. It was Connor saying without words everything he felt: gratitude, desire, promise, devotion. His mouth moved against hers with deliberate precision, savoring, memorizing every angle, every taste. His tongue traced the outline of her lips before deepening the kiss, exploring slowly, as if he had all the time in the world and wanted to use every second. Pia melted against him, her arms rising to wrap around his neck, her fingers burying themselves in his still damp hair. She opened herself to him completely, letting him in, letting him take, but also giving back, her tongue meeting his, dancing, teasing, promising. Connor moaned low against her mouth, a guttural sound that came from deep in his chest. His hands descended from her face to her shoulders, then to her back, pulling her closer, always closer, as if there was never enough proximity, as if he wanted to fuse her to him. The kiss deepened even more. Connor tilted his head, changing the angle, intensifying the contact. Pia felt her knees weaken, and if it weren't for his strong arms holding her, she would have fallen. Every touch of his tongue was a promise, every movement of his lips was a silent oath. When they finally separated, it was only because they needed to breathe. But even so, they didn't pull away. Connor rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed, breathing heavy and irregular. Pia, he whispered her name like a prayer. You're destroying me. Good, she replied, surprising herself with her courage. Because you're doing the same to me. Connor opened his eyes, and what she saw there made her tremble. It wasn't just desire, though there was plenty of that. It was something bigger, deeper, more frightening. It was the promise that this was just the beginning, that there was much more to come, that they had crossed a point of no return. He kissed her again, once, twice, 3 times, short, intense kisses that were like signatures at the end of a contract. Then he held her face between his hands and looked into her eyes. I don't want to rush you, he said, his voice hoarse but serious. I don't want you to regret anything. Pia placed her hands over his. I won't regret it, she said with conviction. Not you, never you. Connor briefly closed his eyes, as if those words were too much, as if he needed a moment to process their weight. When he opened them again, there was gratitude there, but also determination. Then let me do this right, he said. Let me court you the way you deserve. Let me prove I'm worthy of you. Pia smiled, her eyes burning with tears that weren't from sadness. For you've already proven it, she whispered. Every day, every time you stay, every time you choose to be here, you prove it. Connor pulled her into an embrace, holding her tight against his chest, one hand at the base of her head, the other on the small of her back. Pia allowed herself to melt there, feeling his heart beating strong against her ear, feeling his strong arms wrapping around her, feeling for the first time in years that she was home. I'm not going anywhere, Connor murmured against the top of her head. You understand? I'm here, I'm staying. I know, Pia replied, holding him tighter. I know. They stayed like that for long minutes, just holding each other, breathing together, letting the promise of that moment seep into every part of them. When they finally let go, Connor kissed her forehead tenderly. Should we eat before it burns? Pia laughed, looking at the stove where the stew still simmered gently. Good idea. They ate together at the small table, talking softly about things of no importance but constantly touching, knees brushing under the table, fingers intertwining when passing salt or bread, gazes meeting and holding for seconds that seemed eternal. And when the night grew late and Connor finally stood to leave, Pia held his hand. "Stay," she said simply. Connor looked at her, the silent question in his eyes. "Just to sleep," Pia clarified, her face flushed. "I just don't want you to leave yet." A slow, tender smile spread across Connor's face. "I'll stay," he promised. And he stayed. The full moon hanging in the sky poured silver light through the small bedroom window, painting everything with a soft, ethereal glow. The night's silence was profound, broken only by the distant call of owls and the occasional whisper of wind in the trees. Inside the cabin, the air was loaded with anticipation, thick with unspoken promises and finally acknowledged desires. Pia sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped in her lap, her heart beating so hard she was sure Connor could hear it from across the room. She had changed from her work dress into a simple white slip, nothing fancy, just clean cotton fabric that had been washed so many times it was soft as silk against her skin. Her hair fell loose over her shoulders for the first time since Connor had met her, dark waves framing her face and cascading down her back. Connor stood near the door, leaning against the frame, just watching. He had removed his boots and left his hat in the kitchen. His shirt was still on, but unbuttoned to mid-chest, revealing tanned skin and the beginning of a line of dark hair that descended down his abdomen. His eyes traced every line of her, not with cheap lust, but with a reverence that made Pia feel sacred. "Are you sure?" he asked for the third time that night, his voice hoarse but gentle. "Because if you're not, we can wait. I can wait. I'd wait forever for you." Pia raised her eyes to meet his through the silvery twilight. There was fear there. She wasn't going to lie about that. Fear of the unknown, fear of surrendering completely, fear that in the morning things might be different. But beneath the fear was something stronger: desire, trust, need. And for the first time in years, she decided to be brave. "I'm sure," she said, her voice firm despite her racing heart. "Come here." Connor moved away from the doorframe and walked to her slowly, each step measured and deliberate. When he reached her, he stopped, still giving her space, still making it clear she had control, that she could change her mind at any moment. Pia extended her hand. Connor took it, intertwining his large, calloused fingers with hers, and let her pull him closer. When his knees touched the edge of the bed, Pia slid her hands up the front of his shirt, feeling the heat of his skin through the fabric, feeling muscles contract under her touch. "I don't know," she began, her voice hesitant. "It's been so long since I don't know if I'll know how." Connor released one hand and placed a finger under her chin, lifting her face so their eyes met. "There's no right or wrong way," he said softly. "There's just the two of us, here, now. And I promise to treat you the way you deserve." Pia's eyes burned with unshed tears, not from sadness but from gratitude, from relief, from something so deep and true it had no name. She leaned forward and kissed him, soft at first, just lips touching, breaths mingling. But Connor responded with that contained intensity she already knew, deepening the kiss slowly, his tongue tracing the outline of her lips before exploring further. His hands found her waist, then moved up her ribs, thumbs brushing the sides of her breasts through the thin fabric of the slip. Pia gasped against his mouth, her entire body awakening to sensations she had forgotten existed. Connor laid her down carefully, never breaking the kiss, his large body partially covering hers as he propped himself on one elbow to avoid crushing her. His other hand continued exploring, tracing the curve of her hip, the line of her thigh, moving up again to outline her waist, the sides of her breasts, her bare shoulders. Pia felt her hands gain courage of their own, sliding over his broad shoulders, pushing the shirt off. Connor pulled away just enough to remove it completely, tossing it aside before returning to her. Now there was no fabric between his chest and hers, just the thin slip that hid nothing. Pia could feel every line of muscle, every inch of warm skin, every beat of his heart against hers. "You're beautiful," Connor whispered, his eyes traveling over every inch of her face in the moonlight. "So beautiful that sometimes it hurts to look at you." Pia blushed, looking away, but Connor held her face and brought her back. "No," he said firmly. Don't hide from me. Never hide from me. She nodded, unable to speak through the emotion tightening her throat. Connor kissed her again, on the mouth, on the cheek, along her jawline, descending down her neck. Each kiss was a mark, a promise, a mapping. His lips found the sensitive spot just below her ear, and Pia moaned low, her hands gripping his shoulders. "You like that?" he murmured against her skin, his voice hoarse. "Yes," Pia whispered, the word coming out trembling. Connor continued the journey, kissing her collarbone, the space between her breasts, her belly through the thin fabric. His hands followed the path of his lips, caressing, exploring, learning every curve, every response. When his fingers found the hem of the slip, he stopped, looking up to meet her eyes. "May I?" he asked, always asking, always respecting. Pia nodded, and Connor lifted the fabric slowly, revealing her skin inch by inch, thighs, hips, belly, breasts, until finally passing over her head and leaving her completely exposed to the moonlight. Connor remained still for a moment, just looking. And Pia, who should have felt vulnerable and ashamed, felt powerful, because the way he looked at her, as if she were a work of art, a miracle, something too precious to be real, made her feel there was nothing wrong with her body, with her curves, with the marks life had left. "Perfect," Connor whispered, lowering himself to kiss her again. Pia's hands went to his belt, clumsy fingers trying to unbutton it. Connor helped, removing his pants and staying only in underwear for a moment before removing that too. Now there was nothing between them, just skin against skin, heat against heat. Connor positioned himself between her legs, supporting himself on his forearms to avoid putting all his weight on her. Their eyes met and held, dark amber meeting soft brown, question meeting answer. "If it hurts, you tell me," he said. "If you want to stop, we stop, okay?" "Okay." Pia agreed, her hands rising to hold his face. Connor entered slowly, so slowly it was almost torture. Pia felt the pressure, the stretching, a brief twinge of discomfort that quickly transformed into something more: fullness, connection, completeness. When he was fully inside, they both remained still, just breathing, adjusting, feeling. "Are you okay?" Connor asked, his voice tense from the effort of controlling himself. "I am," Pia whispered. "I'm more than okay." Connor began to move, slow, deep, each movement deliberate and full of intention. There was no rush. It was a dance they were learning together, a rhythm they built together. Pia's low moans mixed with Connor's guttural sounds. Breaths became faster, more irregular. Sweat began to glisten on their skin under the moonlight. Hands gripped, bodies arched. Pleasure built in waves that grew and grew. Connor kissed every inch of skin he could reach, neck, shoulders, lips, and Pia responded, her nails lightly scratching his back, her hips rising to meet each movement. "Pia." Connor moaned her name like a prayer. "God, Pia, don't stop," she begged, feeling something build deep in her belly, something she hadn't felt in so long she'd forgotten what it was like. "Please don't stop." "Never," he promised. "I'll never stop." The rhythm increased, became more urgent, more desperate. And then, like a wave breaking on the shore, pleasure exploded. Pia cried out low, her body arching, every muscle contracting. Connor followed moments later, his body trembling, his face buried in her neck, her name leaving his lips in a reverent whisper. They stayed like that for long moments, intertwined, sweaty, breathing hard. Connor eventually rolled to the side, pulling Pia with him so she rested her head on his chest. His hand lazily stroked her hair, fingers tracing meaningless patterns. "I'm not leaving," Connor whispered in the silence, kissing the top of her head. "I don't want you to," Pia replied, nestling closer to his chest, listening to the heart that beat strong and steady. And there, in the silver light of the moon, wrapped in each other, they fell asleep. When the sun rose, it found them still intertwined, and Pia knew her life would never be the same again. 3 days after that night that changed everything, the fragile peace Pia and Connor had built was brutally interrupted. The sun was high in the sky when the sound of approaching horses echoed across the property. Not the calm trot of passing travelers, but the heavy, intentional gallop of men with a purpose. Pia was in the yard, hanging clothes on the line. Connor's shirt swayed in the wind beside her dresses, a domestic and intimate image that warmed her heart every time she looked at it. She had woken that morning in his arms, her face buried in his broad chest, his fingers tracing lazy circles on her back. It had been perfect, peaceful. For the first time in years, Pia had woken without fear of the day to come. But the sound of horses changed all that instantly. She dropped the sheet she was holding and ran to the front of the house, her heart already racing with a bad feeling. Connor was in the barn fixing one of the beams that had started to rot. He also heard the horses and came out quickly, the hammer still in his hand, his eyes narrowing when he saw the cloud of dust approaching on the road. 3 men appeared, mounted on dark horses, wearing worn, dust-covered travel clothes. But they weren't ordinary travelers. There was something in their eyes, in the way they carried weapons visibly on their hips, in the way they looked around like predators assessing territory, that made every instinct in Pia scream danger. The man in front, the leader presumably, was tall and thin with a scar that cut from his forehead to his left cheek. His eyes were cold, calculating, empty of any humanity. When he saw Connor standing in front of the barn, a cruel smile appeared on his face. "Connor West," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "It's been a while." Connor didn't move, but Pia saw his muscles tense, his jaw clench. She knew that posture now. It was that of a man preparing to fight. "Dalton," Connor replied, his voice flat, emotionless. "What do you want?" Dalton dismounted slowly, the other 2 men doing the same. They spread out slightly, creating a strategic formation that blocked any escape route. They were experienced men, dangerous men. "You know what I want," Dalton said, walking closer. "The debt's still outstanding, Connor. 3 years doesn't erase what you owe." "I don't owe anything," Connor said firmly, but Pia could hear the tension under the words. "That poker hand was rigged and you know it. I don't pay debts from cheating." Dalton laughed, a humorless sound that made the hairs on Pia's neck stand up. "That's not what the others saw, and their word is worth as much as yours. So you have 2 choices, pay what you owe with interest or we collect another way." That's when Dalton noticed Pia for the first time. His eyes slid over her in a way that made her want to cover herself, that made her feel dirty just from being under that gaze. An even more unpleasant smile appeared on his face. "Or maybe," he said slowly, taking a step toward her, "we can negotiate another kind of payment." Connor moved so fast he seemed like a blur. In 1 second he was in front of the barn, the next he was between Dalton and Pia, his body positioned protectively, his fists clenched at his sides. "You don't touch her," Connor said, and there was a promise of violence so clear in his voice that even Dalton stopped. "You don't look at her. You don't think about her. Understood?" Dalton raised his hands in false surrender, but the smile didn't disappear. "Easy, Connor. Just assessing available assets." "She's not an asset," Connor growled, "and you're leaving my property now." "Your property?" Dalton looked around, feigning surprise. "Didn't know you'd settled down. How sweet." The lone wolf finally found a den. That's when Pia moved. She had been paralyzed for a moment, processing the threat, understanding that Connor's past had finally caught up with him. But when she saw the tension in his body, when she realized he was prepared to fight, possibly die, to protect her, something inside her ignited. She wasn't a helpless damsel. She had survived alone for years. She had learned to shoot when her husband left, had learned to defend herself, to protect what was hers. And Connor was hers now. She had chosen him, and he had chosen her, and no one was going to take that from her. Pia walked calmly to the porch, climbed the steps, and entered the house. Connor looked back, confused for a moment, but maintained his position between the men and the door. She returned seconds later, and what she carried in her hands made Dalton stop smiling. It was a rifle, old but well-maintained. And the way Pia held it, firm, confident, her finger near the trigger but not on it yet, made it clear she knew exactly how to use it. She descended the steps slowly and walked until she was beside Connor, the rifle pointed down but ready to be raised in a second. "He doesn't owe anything," Pia said, her voice firm and clear without trembling. "And you're on my land." Dalton looked at her in surprise, then at Connor. then back at her. The dynamic had changed. It was no longer just Connor against three. Now it was 2 against 3, and the woman had a gun. "Little lady," Dalton began, using a condescending tone. "No," Pia cut him off, raising the rifle slightly. "I'm not your little lady. I'm the owner of this land, and you and your men are invading my property, threatening the person I love. So you have a choice. Leave now, or I start shooting." One of the other men, a stocky guy with a thick mustache, took a step forward, his hand going to the weapon on his hip. "You don't have the nerve." The shot echoed across the property before he finished the sentence. Pia had shot at the ground, inches from his foot. Dirt and rocks exploded upward, making the man jump back with a shout of surprise. "The next one won't miss," Pia said calmly, already reloading. "And neither will the third." She looked directly at Dalton, her eyes hard as steel. "Get off my land." The silence that followed was tense, charged, dangerous. Connor moved slightly, placing himself in an even more protective position relative to Pia, ready to attack if any of the men made a wrong move. His hand had gone to his belt, where Pia knew he kept a knife. Dalton assessed the situation, his eyes going from Connor to Pia, to the rifle, to his own men who now seemed less confident. He was calculating the odds, weighing whether the fight was worth it. Finally, he spat on the ground and took a step back. "This isn't over, Connor," he said, his voice loaded with promise. "You may have found a little dog with teeth, but eventually she'll need to let her guard down, and when that happens, Connor interrupted, his voice low and dangerous, "you'll still have to get through me. And I promise you, Dalton, you won't like how that ends." The 2 men's eyes met, a silent battle of wills, a measure of strength. Dalton was the one who looked away first. "Let's go," he grumbled to his men. "This place isn't worth it." The 3 mounted their horses, but before leaving, Dalton looked at Pia one last time. "You chose poorly, ma'am," he said. "Men like Connor West don't stay. They never stay." "He stays," Pia replied with absolute certainty. "Because he's not like you. He never was." Dalton shrugged and spurred his horse. The 3 departed at a heavy gallop, the cloud of dust eventually disappearing in the distance. For a long moment, neither Connor nor Pia moved. They just stood there, side by side, watching until they were sure the men had really left. Then, slowly, Connor turned to her. What Pia saw on his face surprised her. It wasn't anger that she had put herself in danger. It wasn't fear for what could have happened. It was pride. It was admiration. It was love. "You," he began, his voice failing. Pia lowered the rifle and turned completely to him. "You're mine," she said simply. "And I protect what's mine." Connor pulled her into a hug so tight it almost took the air from her lungs. His arms wrapped around her completely, his face buried in her hair, his entire body trembling with adrenaline and emotion. "I thought," he whispered against the top of her head. "When he looked at you, I thought—" "I know." Pia interrupted gently, squeezing him back. "But I'm fine. We're fine." Connor pulled back enough to hold her face between his hands, his eyes traveling over every detail, as if he needed to make sure she was whole, unharmed. "You're incredible," he said, his voice full of reverence. "You know that. You're the bravest, strongest, most incredible woman I've ever met." Pia smiled, despite her still racing heart. "I learned from the best." Connor kissed her then, deep, desperate, full of gratitude and residual fear, and love so intense it seemed to overflow. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers. "They might come back," he said low. "I know," Pia replied. "And if they come back, we'll face them together. Again." Connor nodded, a decision forming in his eyes. "Together," he repeated, "always together." And there, standing in the middle of the yard under the hot sun, still trembling with adrenaline, they sealed that promise with another kiss. Because they were no longer 2 individuals alone. They were a unit, a force, a love that no one would destroy. The sun rose differently that morning. It wasn't just another dawn painting the sky orange and pink. It was the first day of the rest of their lives. The threat had passed. Dalton's men didn't return that night, or the next, and as the days turned into weeks, the tension finally began to dissipate, replaced by something more solid, more permanent. Connor had stayed alert the first nights, sleeping lightly, waking at any unusual sound. But Pia was always there, her hand resting on his chest, her soft breathing against his neck, anchoring him back to the present, reminding him he was no longer alone, no longer running. That particular morning, Pia woke before him. Something rare, since Connor was always the first to rise. She lay there for a moment, just watching him sleep. The soft light of dawn entered through the window, illuminating his face in a way that made him look younger, more at peace. The worry lines that normally marked his forehead had softened. His lips were slightly parted, his breathing deep and regular. He was beautiful, not in a conventional way. There were too many scars, too many marks from a hard life. But to Pia, every imperfection was perfect. Every scar told a story of survival. Every line on his face was evidence of experience. He was real, solid, hers. Connor opened his eyes slowly, as if sensing the weight of her gaze. When their eyes met, a slow, sleepy smile spread across his face. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice hoarse with sleep. "Good morning," Pia replied, leaning in to kiss him softly. Connor pulled her closer, deepening the kiss, his hands tracing the familiar path down her back. But before things could intensify, he pulled away and held her face between his hands. "Come with me," he said. "I want to show you something." Curious, Pia followed him out of bed. They dressed quickly, he in his work pants and shirt, she in a simple cotton dress. Connor took her hand and guided her out of the house, through the yard, following a trail that led to a small rise behind the property. They climbed in silence, fingers intertwined, the fresh morning air filling their lungs. When they reached the top, Connor stopped and turned to her, his eyes shining with something she couldn't decipher. "Look," he said, pointing to the horizon. Pia turned, and what she saw took her breath away. From that elevated point, the entire property stretched below them, the small cabin with its morning smoke rising from the chimney, the newly repaired barn, the fields that were beginning to show signs of life after years of abandonment, and beyond that, the rolling hills of West Hollow, bathed in the golden light of dawn, stretching as far as the eye could see. "It's beautiful," Pia whispered, amazed. "I used to come here," Connor said softly. "In the first days after I arrived, I'd stand here looking, trying to decide if I was going to stay or leave like I always did." Pia looked at him, her heart tightening. "And what made you stay?" Connor turned completely to her, taking both hands. "You," he said simply. "Every time I thought about leaving, I remembered your face. The way you looked at me, how you didn't judge me for my past, but saw me for what I could be. And I realized that for the first time in my life, I wanted to be better, not because someone was forcing me, but because I wanted to be worthy of you." Tears burned in Pia's eyes. "Connor, let me finish," he asked gently. "Because I need to say this." He took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "I spent years running from everything, from commitments, from connections, from anything that could tie me down. I thought freedom meant having nothing to lose. But I was wrong. I was miserably, completely wrong." Connor squeezed her hands. "True freedom isn't having nothing to lose. It's having something so valuable you fight with everything you have to protect it. It's waking up every day and choosing to be here, choosing this person, choosing this life. And I choose you, Pia. Every day. Forever." The tears finally overflowed, running down Pia's cheeks. But she was smiling, a smile so wide and genuine it made her face hurt. "I choose you too." As she said, her voice choked. "I choose you today and tomorrow and every day to come. You saved me, Connor. From a life without color, without hope, without love. You showed me it's still worth risking your heart." Connor pulled her into an embrace, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. But she didn't care. She wanted to be like this, wrapped in him, protected, loved. When they finally separated, Connor reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. Pia looked down and saw a simple ring, just a silver band, no stones, no ornaments, but it was perfect. "I made this," Connor explained, a little nervous for the first time since she'd known him. With what was left of the silver, I found cleaning the well. It's not much, I know, and if you want to wait until I can buy something better— It's perfect, Pia interrupted, more tears flowing. It's absolutely perfect. Connor held her left hand, trembling slightly, and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made to be there. "Marry me," he said, not as a question, but as a plea. "Let me spend the rest of my life proving to you I'm worthy of this choice. Let me wake up beside you every day. Let me grow old with you." "Yes," Pia said without hesitation. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Connor picked her up in his arms and spun her, laughing. A deep, genuine, completely happy laugh. When he set her back down, he kissed her with so much passion, so much promise, so much devotion, that Pia felt even her toes tingle. They stood there on top of that hill as the sun continued to rise, painting the world in shades of gold and hope. They held each other, planned the future in whispers, dreamed about the days to come. "We're going to build a life here," Connor said, his chin resting on top of her head. "A real life, with deep roots. And children?" Pia asked timidly. "Do you want children?" Connor pulled back to look at her, and what she saw in his eyes made her melt. "I want everything with you," he said. "Children, grandchildren, a lifetime of memories. I want silly fights about who forgot to close the chicken coop and reconciliations on the porch under the stars. I want to see you with grey hair and still think you're the most beautiful woman in the world. I want everything, Pia, everything you want to give me." "Then you'll have it," Pia promised. "All my love, all my life, everything is yours." They descended the hill hand in hand, returning to the cabin that was now truly their home. And when they reached the porch, Connor stopped, pulled her close, and held her face between his hands. "You saved me," he whispered. "We saved each other," Pia corrected gently, placing her hand over his heart. "Together, together." Connor agreed and sealed the promise with a kiss. That day, the news spread through West Hollow. The lone cowboy who had appeared out of nowhere had found his home. The woman everyone thought would live alone forever had found her love. And together, they proved it's never too late to start over, to choose courage instead of fear, to open your heart even after it's been broken. Years later, when people passed by the property on the outskirts of town, they always commented about the couple who lived there, about how they were always together, working side by side in the fields, sitting on the porch at sunset, walking hand in hand around the property, about how, even after decades, they still looked at each other as if it were the first day. "That's an unbreakable love," people would say. And they were right. Because when two broken souls find each other and decide to heal together, when two courageous hearts choose to love despite fear, when two people commit not just on good days, but also on difficult ones, that love doesn't break. It grows, it deepens, it becomes legend. And Connor and Pia's love burned so strong, so true, so pure, that it warmed not only their own lives, but touched everyone who witnessed it. Some stories end, but theirs was only beginning. Sometimes courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about feeling the fear and choosing to love anyway. Connor and Pia weren't perfect. They were wounded, scarred, scared, but they chose each other every day, and in that, they built something time can't erase. Because true love isn't finding someone without scars. It's finding someone whose scars fit perfectly with yours. It's looking into another person's eyes and recognizing, you survived too, and now we survive together. And maybe this story isn't just about them. Maybe it's also about you, about the courage to surrender when everything tells you to protect yourself, about choosing to stay when it would be easier to run. Because in the end, we all want the same thing. Someone who stays, someone who sees us, with all our flaws, all our fears, and chooses to stay anyway. Connor stayed, Pia fought, and together they proved that love is worth every risk. And you? Would you have the courage to handle a love like that? If this story touched something inside you, if you felt every beat of their hearts as if it were your own, leave your like now. That simple gesture tells us you were here, present, feeling every word with us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories that will make your heart race and your soul awaken. Become a member to get early access to the narratives still to come. And if you really felt it was worth every second, click the super thanks button. Your support makes all the difference and allows us to continue bringing stories that move, that transform, that touch the soul. In the comments, tell us, where are you listening to this story from? Which part moved you the most? Have you lived a love like this, or are you still waiting for your Connor or your Pia to arrive? Until the next story. And remember, true love is always worth it. Always.
Thanks for watching!